This is Chris Liu. Let's get started. Welcome to today's webinar. We will be discussing the challenging business environment in Asia and how to navigate it successfully. For those of you that are new to the FiscalNote Executive Institute, my name is Chris Liu and I'm a senior advisor at the company. Just a few housekeeping notes. This session is being recorded. I know this is sort of a challenging period of time during lots of things going on. We've got a holiday weekend, so a lot of people wanted to be on but couldn't. So we'll be recording this, and we'll also be sending it out in the follow-up email to not only participants, but posting it in other places. We'll do about 30 minutes of moderated conversation between myself and the panelists, and then open it up for questions. We have both a chat box and a question and answer box. I'm sure everyone is now familiar with how to use Zoom, but if you would like to submit a question, you can start queuing them up in the question box. And obviously, as you feel free to engage with other people in the room, feel free to use the chat box. So today we are joined by three wonderful panelists. Let me introduce them to you. We have Craig Allen, President of the U.S. Business Council, U.S. China Business Council. That's an important word to be missing. Prior to joining USCBC, Craig had a distinguished career in public service. His last government post was as U.S. Ambassador to Brunei Darussalam. Before that, he served in Washington as Deputy Assistant Secretary for both China and then Asia in the Department of Commerce International Trade Administration. His overseas postings also include serving in the U.S. embassies in South Africa, China, Japan, and Taiwan. We also have Alex Feldman, who is the Chairman, President, and CEO of the U.S. ASEAN Business Council. Alex's government experience is long as well and includes senior roles in the Department of State, leading the Bureau of International Information Programs with the rank of Assistant Secretary. Alex also served as a senior advisor to the U.S. Undersecretary of Commerce for International Trade. And then we also have Meredith Miller, who co-leads the Albright Stonebridge Group's East Asia and Pacific practice. Prior to joining ASG, Meredith was Senior Vice President at the National Bureau of Asian Research. Her government experience includes positions in the National Security Council, as well as the State Department, where she served as Deputy Director of the Office of Economic Policy in the Bureau of East Asia and Pacific Affairs. Before we jump into the topic, let me just give each of the panelists just a moment to talk about their organizations and the work that they do in Asia. So let me just start going in reverse order. Meredith, tell us a little bit about Albright Stonebridge and the work you all do for your clients.
Great. Well, thanks very much, Chris, for the introduction. I'm very happy to be here representing the Albright Stonebridge Group. We are a global strategic advisory firm that was founded over 15 years ago by former Secretary of State Madeleine Albright and President Clinton's National Security Advisor Sandy Berger. Since that time, we have grown to include over 230 country and sectoral experts, and we serve our clients through on-the-ground teams in over 40 markets around the world. We provide a variety of services that range from insights on geopolitical, regulatory, political, and economic frameworks to developing strategies for market entry or around particular issue advocacy or in corporate social sustainability, just to name a few. And we also help our clients implement those strategies on the ground through our teams and through our relationships with key stakeholders in government, in civil society, and in the business community. So thanks again very much for having me. It's a time of tremendous transition in the region, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Great. Let me turn it over to Craig to talk about the U.S.-China Business Council.
Well, thank you, Chris. Great pleasure to be here with Alex and Meredith. Thank you very much. The U.S.-China Business Council is a membership organization. We've been at this for almost 50 years. And our mission, very simply, is to advocate on behalf of American business in China. I think, as all of you will know, American business in China is very big. many hundreds of billions of dollars of investment there. And our members are the largest companies that have invested there, and some smaller companies as well. As many as 2.4 million Americans work on U.S.-China trade. Every single one of those jobs is important, and we're hopeful to be able to expand our exports to China, our trade with China, and our investment in China. So these are obviously challenging times, and a good time to be having this conversation. So thank you very much for inviting me.
Wonderful. I think Alex is going to log back in, log back off to try to see if we can get a better connection from him. Let's dive into the questions. Craig, let me start with you. And I'm going to ask both Craig and Meredith to level set where we are from an economic perspective. Obviously, countries are still dealing with COVID-19, so we don't want to say we're out of that. But Craig, from your perspective, where's the Chinese economy at this moment, and sort of as you look ahead the next 6 months to a year?
So if COVID-19 does not return in a big way, the Chinese economy will probably grow between 2% and 3% this year and up to 9% in 2021. So because the Chinese were quite good at controlling the pandemic, and limiting its impact with very severe restrictions. Therefore, they're going to come out of this more quickly and expand quite rapidly. So China will be the world's probably sole growth engine in both 2020 and even more so in 2021. And that's a good opportunity for American exporters and American companies wanting to do business there. That's all contingent, however, upon continued control of the epidemic and the Chinese being able to forestall any large-scale outbreaks. They're prepared for small-scale, localized and regional, but as we're finding, this virus is very clever, and it is not certain that it is fully under control by any means. So everything is taken under advisement as to the epidemiological contingencies out there. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Alex, Alex just jumped back on. Let me, I know Alex was trying to find a better connection, so hopefully we have a better one. Alex, I just started by sort of doing a little table setting as to where what the economic conditions are in Asia right now. From your perspective, where is Southeast Asia from an economic perspective? We'll knock on wood and say post-COVID. Your thoughts about where we are now, next 6 months, a year from now?
So Southeast Asia is in a generally good place. I mean, certainly during COVID, we're now opening up in Southeast Asia across the region, and life is starting to get back towards normal. But I think given everything that's been happening in COVID and with the U.S.-China relationship, Southeast Asia is the region of the world that will benefit the most from the realignment of supply chains. And that's already happened. For Vietnamese exports to the United States were up almost 20% last year. And that's a direct reflection of both Chinese and American and other Western companies moving parts of their supply chain to Vietnam. And we can replicate that in other parts of Southeast Asia as well.
Meredith, let me just ask you to take kind of a one step back from this. And as you advise your clients who are thinking about Asia more broadly, sort of from a macro perspective, how should they be thinking about Asia from an economic standpoint? Are there places that they should stay away from, that there are places that they should go to? Sort of how should they be thinking about this region from an economic perspective?
Great, thanks, Chris. And let me just add to what Craig and Alex said, that I think investors, policymakers, everyone is facing a tremendous amount of uncertainty right now, right? So, the IMF, other leading institutions are predicting that Asia will rebound, driven in large part by China, but also other economies in the region like Vietnam, which Alex has pointed out, has done a very good job in containing the virus thus far. But those predictions are all predicated on assumptions about how the virus progresses in the near term. the level to which global trade resumes, consumers restart their former spending habits. So a lot of uncertainty being faced. But I think for business people and investors, they can look at the fundamentals of the region. So if you're talking about Southeast Asia, for example, it is one of the largest and fastest growing markets in the world. There are very favorable demographics. And over the medium to long term, which is the perspective that I would advise any investor to take towards the region, it will continue to be a very strong catalyst for growth with a tremendous amount of potential, particularly in areas where there's growing demand for services like education and health. And COVID has shown, I think, an even greater spotlight on the need for that and the needs for policymakers and companies to be innovative in the near term. So if I was going to say, look at some areas, I would say, look at ways that your products, your technology, your services can help to address some of the challenges that have really been thrown into acute relief by the pandemic and how to keep economies going in this new reality we're all in. Where we're probably going to see fits and starts in terms of restrictions on movement, going to our offices and going to our schools.
Craig, let me obviously, we've been talking a lot about economic uncertainties. There's also huge political uncertainties. One of the biggest ones right now is the state of relations between the United States and China. It kind of seems to be up and down and probably more down now, especially in light of what's happening in Hong Kong. How would you assess what the U.S.-China relationship is right now, and what's the impact on that for the rest of Asia?
So the U.S.-China relationship right now is extremely complex. We are watching some 380 pieces of potential legislation on the Hill, almost all of which are have an impact on China trade. The if you will, problems of the Theodicies trap have recently been compounded by COVID-19 and the national security regulation or national security law that has been imposed on Hong Kong as of this morning. And as a result of that, we have a relationship that is characterized by confrontation across virtually all elements of foreign affairs, be it ideological, economic, technological, counselor, et cetera, et cetera. And that makes doing business in China for American firms more difficult. How does that affect the rest of Asia? I think is a complex question. I think Alex hit on some of the positives that some suppliers, Chinese, third country, American, have moved to Vietnam, also Malaysia and Thailand. And so there are positive elements of this, but I would also rush to say that the uncertainty, the instability is not welcomed by anyone, and it's making doing business throughout the region all the more fraught and more difficult. The last thing that any Asian or European or anybody wants to do is choose between the United States and China, and they're getting pushed and pulled in both directions, from both directions to do exactly that. And I think everyone is going to try and avoid that trap to do maximum business with both sides. Thank you.
Meredith, can I ask you, and just to continue on Craig's point, I mean, we've had a relatively stable, the United States has had a relatively stable set of economic and security relationships with a variety of Asian countries, really since the post-World War II era. What is the status of those relationships right now?
So it's a tremendously diverse region, and U.S. relationships are diverse throughout. So maybe I could just echo and pick up on a few of the points that Craig made, where I think there is some unanimity. And one is certainly that no countries in the region want to have to, quote unquote, choose between the U.S. and China. And there's a range of economic reasons for that, which Craig mentioned, but There's also the fact that, as relatively smaller countries vis-a-vis the US and China, it's important diplomatic strategy to be able to hedge a bit, to be able to balance and create some independent space. So to the extent that that's narrowing, I think that is cause for significant consternation throughout the region. In terms of the diversity of views, I read a study, I'm sure Alex has seen this too, and Craig as well, that a Singaporean think tank put out at the end of last year, which really showed, it was a survey of Southeast Asian elites, there's a fair amount of mistrust right now towards both the US and China. And I think that is also a change, I think, in terms of how countries in the region perceive that the US withdrawal from multilateralism, from leadership on trade, has sort of channeled further this dynamic of uncertainty. And that survey also reflected the diversity of views I was talking about. There was one question, who do you trust more to do the right thing, the US or China? In Vietnam, 80% said the United States. In Indonesia, it's a tie. So really, there's quite a range of views around the region. But I think the thing that unites is wanting to have both the US and China engaged as constructive partners.
Alex, let's dive in more specifically to Southeast Asia. Such an important area. And, in contrast to what Craig just mentioned about the confrontation between the US and China, it feels to me, and I'd love to get your perspective, that the US has been largely absent from this region in Southeast Asia over the last couple of years. The president has kind of been sporadically attending the Asian summits. How much of that, what has that done for kind of this trust that those countries have traditionally had for the United States? And what does that mean for economic relations and trade?
Well, first of all, thank you. And, I would say that Southeast Asia is, in fact, the battleground for the future of Asia. And both China and the United States have a vested interest in the region. Most of the countries in the region, their number one trade partner is China. But the number one investor, for the most part, is the United States. Sometimes those numbers get a little confused. So, Vietnam claims Hong Kong to be its second largest investor, and the US its eighth largest, but its largest single tech investment from Intel is classified as a Hong Kong investment. So we would, as a strong member of the U.S. ASEAN Business Council, we would classify Intel's investment in Vietnam as an American investment, but it physically came through their Hong Kong subsidiary. The U.S. has, unfortunately, at the top leaders level, has been absent from the last two ASEAN summits and East Asia summits, where the region gets together. And in order to play in this game, you actually have to show up. And unfortunately, we've had descending levels of participation from the U.S. government. So in 2017, the president did show up briefly in Manila for the ASEAN summit. But then in 2018, he sent Vice President Pence to Singapore. And in 2019, he sent his brand new national security advisor to represent the United States with the leaders of Southeast Asia, as well as leaders of China and Russia as well. So our absence from a number of key meetings is critical and is not helpful to the overall relationship. The Trump administration has repeatedly said that ASEAN is the heart of the Indo-Pacific strategy. They have tried, at least verbally, to put some meat behind that, but the meat has been falling off the bone a little bit, and it's unclear how much of what we've said has actually been accomplished. I think the intent is there, but again, when you're looking at competing against the Belt and Road, we have to at least participate in significant ways in Southeast Asia. And I would be one to advocate that we don't try and go one for one with China on infrastructure investment, although certainly the Development Finance Corporation of the United States now has $60 billion, double what it had before, to invest. It's not only that's for the world, not only for Southeast Asia, but their CEO has been to Indonesia and has indicated that they're going to make significant energy investments in Indonesia. And if we can make that happen and sustain that, that's a step in the right direction. But I think in terms of trade, certainly withdrawing from TPP on day one of the Trump administration was a major blow to our trade and business investments in the region. One last caveat, though, just to put back and go circle around, is that U.S. investment in ASEAN at over almost $300 billion is more investment than the United States has put anywhere else in Asia, and our commitment to the region as a whole in ASEAN. So, and that investment is not moving around. Those are factories and those are facilities that are in place for long haul. So I think there is a commitment on the U.S. businesses part, and I think that there is some division between governments and how they think about the U.S. private sector and how they think about the U.S. government. But certainly as an organization and as U.S. business, we want the U.S. government to show up and to be a major player in this game, if we will.
So I want to bracket what Alex just said about the dichotomy between U.S. businesses and U.S. government. But Craig, just go back to two things that Alex just mentioned, which was TPP and Belt and Road. Obviously, the U.S. has kind of receded in Southeast Asia. Clearly, China has been trying to fill that gap, most notably through Belt and Road. How successful have they been? And do you have a sense of, for a lot of the Southeast Asian countries, whether that's more a marriage of convenience, marriage of necessity? Would they prefer stronger allies, a stronger relationship, a more visible relationship with the U.S., or this is just the way in their mindset geopolitics works?
Well, the first thing I'd say, Chris, is this is a long story. It probably goes back to the Tang Dynasty, or even before, certainly the Ming. There has been Chinese interaction with Southeast Asia forever. And all of the Southeast Asian countries have large Chinese minorities. And they play an important economic role. I would say that the Southeast Asian countries, and I would say it's true of Japan and Korea too, all want the strongest possible American presence there across the board in every way, militarily, technically, education, travel, et cetera, trade and investment. And so we are welcome there, but we have to get off our duff and get over there and work with them. So the Chinese are also welcome because they also bring economic opportunity. But with the United States, it's a much kind of a simpler transaction, if you will. Because we're far away and they know who we are. And China is changing, and China's behavior in the South China Sea, along the Mekong River, and the other river deltas in mainland Southeast Asia are much more threatening to Southeast Asia than you would have perceptions in Africa or Latin America or elsewhere. So this is a complex story, and I'm 100% in agreement with Alex that we need to, that Southeast Asia is a battleground and we need to show up if we're going to win. And that's exactly what we should be doing. Thank you.
Meredith, let me have you pick up on another point that Alex made, which is sort of, the U.S., our leadership has been absent from Southeast Asia, but companies certainly are present there, and all four of us have spent time in government. So we know that, certainly at the departmental level, congressional level, there's still a constant set of engagement. How much can that take the place of a president who is physically not there? And again, speak to more of this idea that you have to show up, and just showing up makes a big difference there.
So I think, as Alex said, and he works, day to day with the U.S. business community, there are very well established and very long-standing relationships between the U.S. business community and different markets within the region. And those companies, for the most part, represent the United States very well. I think the real challenge comes in, relating back to what Craig was saying, is if you look at the nature of Chinese economic and commercial diplomacy and compare it to the US, our systems are organized very differently, right? So China is a state-run economy. They can bring massive amounts of financing. They can direct their companies in a way that is just not a part of our system here in the United States. So while the DFC is a very welcome development, I think they have like $66 billion investment camp, it's still quite small compared to what China is doing or what Japan is doing or Korea or even European Union. And where we excelled in the past was in also bringing our leadership to establishing norms for trade, for commercial diplomacy, and for regional integration. And right now that piece is missing. And I think it's hard to see how we can maintain our presence and our companies can continue to maintain the high profile that they have now without reestablishing that.
I want to remind all of the attendees on the call that the chat box as well as the Q&A box are open, so feel free to add questions to that. We will queue them up for the panelists. Alex, let me just pick up on what Meredith just said. I mean, obviously, Southeast Asia is not just this pawn that is at the mercy of China and the United States, but we also have other countries who recognize the strategic and economic importance, whether it's Japan, whether it's the European Union. Let's add a couple. Let's add Russia. Let's add India to all of the mix. What is the other level of competition that's going on in the region right now?
Well, it's significant. And I think the EU is really picking up their efforts. They have a trade agreement that's in place with Vietnam. Actually, just this year was put into place. They've had discussions with Indonesia and others throughout the realm, and the U.S. has largely been absent in the last 4 years in terms of talking trade. And one of the great things that we had in our camp that could combat things like Belt and Road were our ideas and our leadership, and the multilateral organizations that we're now pulling out of or undermining. So that really hurts us because the ADB, the World Bank, WHO. Are all institutions that we supported and we put up, and our ideas had a major effect on those institutions. And when they spoke, they also spoke for many of the values that the United States holds dear. Yet we're undermining that now, so it's hard to see it. We're not replacing it with any new ideas or new leadership, and even with COVID-19, we've given $82 million to the countries of Southeast Asia to help fight COVID-19 in the last few months. The Trump administration has looked back on the last, I think it's 20 years to talk about the $3.5 billion that we've given to the region as a country. All of that's great, but we've got to move forward, and we've got to find ways to compete not only with the Europeans, but increasingly with others. I mean, the Japanese and Koreans have always been very strong. Today, Vietnam, we're focusing on Vietnam, but there's lots to say about the rest of the region. But Samsung produces almost all of their Galaxy phones for the world in Vietnam. And they're a huge investor in Vietnam. The Japanese have always been huge in Thailand. Toyota has one of its largest manufacturing facilities there. GM's about to pull out, which is unfortunate, but Ford is very much there in Thailand. So there's a lot to be said, but we've got and American companies are growing. The council's growing in terms of membership. So we are seeing increased investment every year, and we are seeing more and more companies realize that the demographics and the geographics of the region make tremendous sense. So when I talk about demographics of Southeast Asia, over 60% or just about 60% of the population is under 35 years old. That's huge for the future and future of business, not only for a workforce, but also for a market for American companies. And our exports, fourth largest export destination for the United States is Southeast Asia. And on a per capita basis, although China is a little bit bigger, at least for now, on a per capita basis, ASEAN people buy more than double what Chinese people buy from the United States in terms of goods. So there's a huge market now, and people are figuring that out. And obviously, the digital economy, which we haven't really touched on, is another battleground. Alibaba, Tencent are investing heavily in Southeast Asia, but so are our companies: Amazon, Microsoft, Google, Facebook. All the majors, as I talked about, Intel have major presence in Southeast Asia. I'll stop there.
Craig, Alex just mentioned in terms of the war of ideas and values, and obviously it's hard not to think about what's happening in Hong Kong right now. And you've got Congress, which is taking lots of actions. And to be fair, the administration is as well. What does that mean, how serious should U.S. companies treat a lot of bills that are going through Congress at the moment? And what would be the impact of those, the real impact versus the symbolic impact?
Well, it's a really great question. And I would rephrase it by saying, to what extent will both governments either encourage or demand decoupling? To a certain extent, both governments, that is Beijing and Washington, seem to have agreed that some level of decoupling in telecom and semiconductors is welcome or even required. There is also talk about strengthening supply chain resilience in pharma and in medical devices. And I think that COVID-19 has been a little bit of a wake-up call there. So both governments are engaged in, at least tacitly, in at least limited decoupling in strategic industries. And the policies being followed by both governments are quite similar. Let us hope that for those industries that are not in the national security area, which is probably 95% of global trade, that we could both follow WTO rules. But that has proven problematic as well. Currently, after the phase one deal, approximately, the average tariff rate on products, Chinese products coming into the US is 17%. And the average tariff rate on American products going into China is about the same. And so there is a process of decoupling of supply chains that is already going on. US exports are down 17% over the last 2 years and probably down another 10% this year. And so this process is ongoing. There is a great deal of tension. Just today, there was an information sheet passed out by the State Department on products coming from Xinjiang. Yet another impetus to watch your supply chains and remove product that might be coming from forced labor in this particular case. So all of this legislation is important. We don't know what's going to pass and what's going to morph into what and how it's going to pass, when it's going to pass, whether it'll be attached to the defense reauthorization bill, as is the case every year. But all companies need to be fully compliant with American law and Chinese law, and that is becoming more and more difficult as the law shifts and, more rapidly than what we're used to seeing in the past. And I would say that that's equally true in China, that laws are changing frequently, making it more and more difficult to be compliant in both countries. And that lack of stability has a chilling impact on investment decisions, both in China and in the United States. Thank you.
Let me remind folks that the question section, Q&A section is open. We've got one question, which I will tee up in a second. but that is certainly open. We've got about 20 minutes of time for people to ask questions. Meredith, let me ask you about another dynamic that we have not talked about, Japan and Korea, which had their own tensions over the last couple of years. They seem to have eased, but would love to get your perspective on that and what that means for U.S. businesses operating in those two countries, or is that those tensions really kind of restricted to, Japanese and Korean companies?
Thanks very much, Chris. So I think, there has been a lessening of tensions, but the underlying issues that drove that initial, confrontation, those remain. So it's something that I would say is important for businesses to continue to pay attention to. The implications of that, were, really targeted between the two countries, but they do impact their economies and potentially business relationships and partnerships that outside investors may have as well. So it's something that I think, no one should assume might not reemerge again in the future.
Craig, let me just flip this question to you, the one that we got in the question section. But obviously, if others want to weigh in, please feel free to do so. Any general thoughts on the tech race between China and the U.S., especially with respect to emerging technologies like AI, self-driving vehicles, et cetera?
Okay, well, I think that this is really the key question in U.S.-China relations. And to a large extent, the tariff war or the trade war is a sideshow. Really, the key battleground is control over the global innovation ecosystem, and particularly in the emerging technologies. So the Trump administration has taken a series of judicial, administrative, and regulatory steps to protect American technology and intellectual property rights on the grounds that that Xi Jinping's civil-military fusion program makes it impossible to differentiate between, or difficult to differentiate between civil and military. And the question of Huawei is kind of the ultimate symbol of this friction that we're facing. So it remains to be seen both the extent to which U.S. regulatory actions are going to impact Chinese R&D and scientific development overall. And it remains to be seen also whether or not the U.S. will be able to bring along its allies in this contest. Certainly the Europeans and the Japanese and the Koreans don't wish to choose between the United States and China as well. The Chinese are putting more than $1 trillion into their quote-unquote new infrastructure, which is basically R&D and Internet of Things. And so that's a lot of money. And American companies are in China, and many of them with R&D. And I would just close this conversation by saying that in 2020, China will graduate 1.8 million STEM students compared to about 650,000 in the United States. So in the STEM fields, China is very strong and will remain strong for the rest of my lifetime. So it behooves us to really think about how the US and China are going to get along with the rest of the world in tech. What are the rules of the road for cooperation? What are the rules of the road for competition? And most importantly, how do you enforce those rules? And the first two questions might be easy, but the enforcement question is really hard. And that's going to be an ongoing question for the foreseeable future. Thank you.
Thanks, Craig. Yeah, Meredith, an interesting question that came through. Let me toss it to you, and hopefully I'm sure you can answer it. Will the erosion of Hong Kong's autonomy impact its role as a global financial services leader? What regional cities are best poised to benefit from the potential decline of Hong Kong's openness and connectivity to global markets?
Sure. Well, I think Craig also would have a lot to say about this, but maybe I can offer a perspective from the broader region, which is, I think, even predating the more recent developments in Hong Kong, we've seen Singapore's position in the region strengthen for particularly financial transactions that are ex-China, right? Broader Asia Pacific. Because of the strength of the governance system, because of the connectivity to Southeast Asia, to India, to the Middle East, it has benefited from both, in some senses, relocation in terms of financial institutions, but also high net worth individuals. I think, and Craig, I defer to you on this, but Hong Kong is still going to be a very important gateway for China and for financial institutions and others who are located there because of their dealings with the mainland. It's still going to be the preferred location. But when you're talking about broader Asia Pacific, I think Singapore is going to continue to benefit from the restrictions that the U.S. and others are considering, and the overall perception of political instability and uncertainty there.
Well, look, we have about 9 minutes, and I have to ask you all this question since we're in the middle of a perpetual presidential election. Thoughts on what a second Trump term means for U.S. relations in Asia versus a potential Biden administration? Craig, let me start with you.
Okay. Well, I think that we have a pretty clear view of what the President Trump's views are on Asia and on the multilateral institutions. And, he is a man of great clarity, and I don't expect him to change. Vis-a-vis a Biden administration, what I would expect to see would be that there would be a much greater emphasis on values and the multilateral institutions and on alliances and partnerships to address challenges. Certainly, the President Trump's inclination to withdraw from the various multilateral institutions would probably be relooked at. I would hope that there would be a refocus on our traditional alliances and friendships in Asia, and they are profoundly long and important to us, be it Australia, Japan, Korea, Singapore, Philippines, and many others. I think that, especially vis-a-vis the Chinese, but also others, that there would probably be greater emphasis on human rights and the rights of LGBT and others, women's rights. And that will probably cause some discomfort throughout the region. But I think, in other words, we would have a return to a much more traditional foreign policy that emphasized engagement. The structural theodicies trap type issues on the security side that we have with China are not going to go away. And probably the high-tech issues are not going to go away. But we would probably address them with a Biden administration in much more close consultation with our allies, partners, and friends, and using multilateral institutions. So that, at least in my view, would be a way forward. Would either administration consider rejoining the TPP? I think it's a very good question to ask. After the recent National People's Congress, China's Premier Li Keqiang said that China would look at joining the TPP. And would that not be a real oddity if China joined the TPP and we withdrew? That to me would be quite unacceptable. Thank you.
Meredith, let me flip it over to you while we wait for Alex. Both to get your perspective on a Biden administration versus second Trump administration, this idea specifically about moving to a more traditional foreign policy, but add this caveat. There used to be kind of a consensus around free trade in this country. It was not a great consensus, but you could get these agreements through. There seems to be a growing antipathy in both parties to free trade at this point right now. So would love to get your take on, how you see a Biden versus Trump administration and what sort of some of these domestic political concerns in the United States mean for relations with Asia.
Great, thanks, Chris. I think that's a really important question. And just keying off of what Craig just said, I think the return to multilateralism would be a key differentiation. And if you look at the range of institutions that the U.S. has withdrawn from or undermined in the case of the WTO, I'm thinking of the UN Human Rights Council, most recently WHO, TPP, the Paris Climate Accord. You would see a Biden administration, reapproaching those talks and re-engaging those institutions, which is really important. But you raise a key point. There is a high degree of concern over the effects of globalization in the United States. In the last election cycle, we saw even Secretary Clinton in her bid for the presidency, although she had been a supporter of TPP, she was very careful in terms of how she talked about that on the campaign trail. What we've seen so far from Biden is that he has, expressed in this run-up to the election his continued commitment to engaging in multilateral trading arrangements, but he's been very careful to say that that would have to be, accompanied by investments in the American workforce, by investments in our own, I think he calls it middle-class competitiveness, if you will, and there would have to be very strong environmental and labor provisions. So I think that's something that's top of mind, is whatever administration comes in is going to have to deal with those realities, which very well could be exacerbated by the economic impacts of COVID, and then our discussion earlier about the impacts of artificial intelligence and other digital technologies that are going to be very disruptive to the workforce here in the United States and other countries around the world as well.
Great. Thank you, Meredith. As a follow-up, we'll be sending out the recording of this webinar, and we'll also be posting it, I think, on our FiscalNote Executive Institute website. So we hope people take a look at it. So thank you again, especially Meredith, Craig, and Alex for your time. And to all of you, have a good afternoon and a safe afternoon.